Hey everybody. Hopefully the wind doesn't destroy this, but if it does, we'll all have to live with it. This is a piece from Marxist.org. It's titled "The Crisis in the American Party, an Open Letter in Reply to Comrade Leon Trotsky" from March 1940 by James Burnham. Jesus Christ. Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman. The reason I'm reading this piece is that it's a primary source from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, and it can kind of give some insight into the split in the Socialist Workers' Party in 1939 to 40, which led to the formation of the Workers' Party under Max Shachtman's leadership, and the continuation of the Socialist Workers' Party under James Buchanan's leadership. So I don't know what's going to be in here, but let's see. Dear Comrade Trotsky, your article of the 15th of December 1939, A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party, raises a number of questions which enable me in reply to present and elaborate the standpoint of the minority in general and of myself personally. The nature of the questions raised and the manner in which you deal with them impose a polemical form upon the present reply, not so much because your article is directly addressed to the party, but primarily because I am compelled to disagree radically and uncompromisingly with the attacks you make upon the minority and the minority's political position, and with the solution you advance for resolving the party crisis. This reply, supplementing the main documents already published by the minority, will speak with the same welcome candor and even bluntness which you employ in your article, and will try to deal with all the essential points you raise, answering all and evading none. First section, Dialectics, Politics, Blocks. You have discovered the class struggle, or rather the class struggle's reflection in the ranks of the party. The Cannon faction represents the proletarian wing of the party. The minority is, quote, incapable of giving the party Marxian leadership, end quote, because the party is, quote, leading a typical petty bourgeois tendency, end quote. As to whether it is permissible to speak of class tendencies and class struggle in the party and the extent to which it is permissible, these questions will be dealt with further on in this document. Here, let us examine the basis for your characterization of the minority faction. What is involved, of course, is not the pride or prestige or subjective feelings of this or that comrade in the minority or of the group as a whole, but the objective validity of the characterization. At the beginning of the crisis in the party, the Cannonites characterized the minority in various ways. Of them all, however, as is pointed out in our document on war and bureaucratic conservatism, only one even pretended to be a political characterization. Namely, the minority is yielding to the pressure of bourgeois patriotism, or as you put it, the minority represents a petty bourgeois tendency. To which we replied, political tendencies, either inside or outside the party, do not arise overnight, nor are they the spontaneously full-fledged product of the whims or aberrations of a group of individuals. Here and there we find an individual who unexpectedly and suddenly, quote, accidentally, end quote, turns into his political opposite. A man with a long record of radicalism may suddenly turn patriot at the outbreak of war. A man with a long record of opportunism may suddenly turn radical at the same time. But these are individual cases and do not represent tendencies. We speak of political tendencies precisely because it is possible to say of a group of people that over an appreciable period of time, as revealed in the record of its political words and deeds, it has tended in a certain political direction and has finally crystallized into a distinct political group or faction or party. An isolated instance or two does not establish a tendency, much less a, quote, petty bourgeois tendency, end quote, one that is, quote, typical, end quote, at that, but at most a mistake or a deviation. Even on this small scale, one can apply the dialectical method and inquire into whether or not a quantitative change has been transformed into a qualitative change. Therefore, continued our reply to the Cannon faction, to maintain your characterization, it is incumbent upon you to indicate in our political record, which is available to you, wherein this tendency has manifested itself in the last year or two among the representative spokesmen of the minority. That is, in attacking us and characterizing us politically, please do no less than all of us together have done with reference to bourgeois political groups, to the Stalinists, to the Thomasites, to the Lovestonites, and even to such groups grouplets as Oler, etc., or in our own movement than we did, for example, with the Snevliet tendency, characterizing it politically on the basis of its established record over a period of years. But this is just what the Canaanites did not do and have not done. Moreover, the Canaanites did not even attempt to do it, for everybody knows that the attempt would be fruitless and doomed in advance to failure. Not because the leading comrades of the minority have no record to look into. Quite the contrary. Not because the leading comrades of the minority have no record to look into. Quite the contrary. The leading comrades of the minority have one. As said above, it is easily available. They are the records of the political committee containing the views of all the comrades on every question. There are articles in the press, there are programs and manifestos, there are brochures and speeches. Let them be cited. There has been no lack of bourgeois, patriotic, anti-Soviet, reformist pressures upon our party in the past. Show us from the record when and where any of our leading comrades yielded to this pressure. I say confidently, it cannot be done. What the records will reveal is that we were not among the last, so far as Burnham and Shachtman in particular are concerned. I say it without false modesty that we were the first. Of those who constantly defended the revolutionary internationalist position on war against all species of reformists, patriots, people's fronters, Stalinist, centrist, left-centrist, ultra-leftist, and who constantly sought to make the party more alert to the need of combating the war danger and all the war danger involved in the ranks of the working class. By what political right, then, on the basis of what facts in our record are we charged with being a petty bourgeois tendency? The Canon faction never answered this question. Its silence implied that the only, quote, right, end quote, it exercised was the right of necessity. It needed to give this political characterization of us, whether grounded in fact or not. You ask in your article, quote, why did Burnham and Shachtman themselves so unexpectedly, the word, quote, unexpectedly, end quote, Comrade Trotsky is itself a sufficient comment upon the unassailability of our political record, shift to the position of the, quote, League of Abandoned Hopes, end quote. That is, of the petty bourgeois intellectuals in retreat. And you answer, quote, it is not difficult to find an explanation. The Kremlin's participation in the Republican camp in Spain was supported by the bourgeois Democrats all over the world. Stalin's work in Poland and Finland is met with frantic condemnation from the same Democrats. In spite of all its noisy formulas, the opposition appears to be a reflection inside the Socialist Workers' Party of the mind of the, quote, left, end quote, petty bourgeoisie. This fact, unfortunately, is incontrovertible, end quote. In face of what, quote, appears to be, end quote, a, quote, incontrovertible fact, end quote, how are we to account for the fact that the pressure of the bourgeois Democrats throughout the Spanish Civil War was not reflected among us in a tendency to yield to people's frontism and the imperialist patriotism which it was imbued? It is true that some ultra-leftists in the party at that time accused us and Cannon and Trotsky of precisely such a tendency, but the, quote, fact, end quote, was just as, quote, incontrovertible, end quote, then as now. Although the Canaanites never sought to find in our political record a justification for the Canaanites' characterization of our group, you have, it is true, presented one article out of that record calculated to establish a connection between our present position and our past, and thereby to warrant your political justification. It is the article Intellectuals in Retreat by Burnham and Shachtman, about which we exchanged some correspondence earlier in 1939. Quoting sections of what the two authors wrote about dialectical materialism, you declare that my allegedly unprincipled block with Burnham in the sphere of sociology, the question of the class nature of the Soviet state, and then in the sphere of politics, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, followed logically from and paralleled my unprincipled, quote, block with Burnham in the sphere of philosophy, end quote, all of which adds up, in your view, to the characteristics of a typical petty bourgeois tendency. Comrade Trotsky, I am, as I wrote you many months ago in reply to your letter on the 20th of January, 1939, only a student in the field of philosophy. The exigencies of party work do not always permit one to extend his knowledge and understanding of dialectical materialism to the degree that to the degree really demanded of a revolutionary Marxist. I've always been greatly impressed by the fact that a generation ago Lenin took time out from daily political struggle, so to speak, in order to devote himself to special studies and a separate volume in defense of Marxian philosophy from its bourgeois and revisionist critics. Lack of time and a more extensive knowledge which it would make possible, have prevented me and others from venturing, however modestly, into a systematic, rounded-out, and thoroughgoing defense of dialectical materialism from dialectical materialism's modern, above all, American critics in the public press. Whenever I can read and study what you and our great teachers have written on the subject, I do so with the greatest attention, yet I must say, your accusations are entirely unwarranted and baseless. Your accusations form an arbitrary construction calculated to buttress a political conclusion which cannot be buttressed objectively. Let me indicate the grounds for this statement. You quote from the article in New International, January 1939, a section which explains how the authors, having different opinions on dialectical materialism, nevertheless write a joint article against the petty bourgeois opponents of Bolshevism. You conclude that in the opinion of the two authors, quote, the method is not of great importance. We shall meditate upon methods sometime when we have more leisure, but now we have other things to do, end quote. Excuse me. Nowhere in the article is there a word that could justify such a conclusion. In your article, you quote one paragraph of our explanation for the joint authorship. You omit from the paragraph a key sentence which I underline here. We wrote, quote, the two authors of the present article differ thoroughly on their estimate of the general theory of dialectical materialism, one of them accepting it and the other rejecting it. This has not prevented them from working for years within a single political organization toward mutually accepted objectives, nor has this required on the part of either of them any suppression of his theoretical opinions in private or public, end quote. But that is not all. The following paragraphs from your article are not less important. Quote, during 1907 to 1908, Lenin was, as is well known, carrying on a philosophical dispute with the Marxists and also a sharp political fight against the Mensheviks. Gorky inclined on the political question towards the Marxists and apparently considered that this might prevent him from making common political cause with Lenin against the Mensheviks on the concrete questions then at issue. On the 25th of February 1908, Lenin wrote to Gorky as follows, quote, I believe I must tell you my view quite openly. A certain scrap among the Bolsheviks on the question of philosophy I now consider quite unavoidable, but to split up on that account would be stupid in my opinion. We have formed a block for the carrying through of a certain tactic in the Social Democratic Labor Party. This tactic we have been and are continuing to carry through without differences of opinion. The only difference of opinion occurred in connection with the boycott of the Third Duma. But firstly, it never reached such a sharp point among us to hint at a split. Secondly, it did not correspond to the difference of opinion of the materialists and the Marxists. For the Marxist Bazarov, for example, was, like myself, against the boycott and wrote about it, a large feuilleton in the Proletariat, the journal then under Bolshevik direction. To obstruct the cause of the carrying through of the tactic of revolutionary social democracy in the Labor Party because of disputes over materialism or Marxism would be, in my opinion, an inexcusable stupidity. We must be at loggerheads over philosophy in such a way that the Proletariat and the Bolsheviks, as a faction of the party, are not affected by it. That is entirely possible, end quote. That was Lenin, and that was a quote within a quote. Now this is back to Trotsky. These wise, responsible, and humane words are those, of course, of the real Lenin, not the sanctimonious pope of the Stalinist fairy tales, nor the one-party tyrant who is now being imaginatively constructed by Eastman, Hooke, and Harrison. Shortly after the time of the above letter, interesting enough, one of the Mensheviks declared in the Neue Zeit that the philosophical dispute was identical with the political dispute. Proletariat made the following editorial statement, quote, in this connection, the editorial board of Proletariat, as the ideological representative of the Bolshevik tendency, deems it necessary to present the following declaration, quote, in reality, this philosophical dispute is not a factual dispute, and in the opinion of the editorial board, it should not be one. Any attempt to represent these differences of opinion as factional is thoroughly erroneous. Among the members of both factions, there are supporters of both philosophical tendencies, end quote, Proletariat. And that's the end of the quote. from Trotsky. In light of these remarks and quotations from Lenin, I still fail to see, as I wrote you months ago, wherein I was wrong in writing the joint article with Burnham and in taking with Burnham the position on the dialectic quoted above. Quite the contrary, under the same circumstances, I would do it again and again tomorrow. You speak of my, quote, block with Burnham in the sphere of philosophy, end quote, but that is precisely the sphere in which we did not make a block. The subtitle of our article was A Political Analysis of Some of the Recent Critics of Bolshevism, Sidney Hook, Max Eastman, Eugene Lyons, Ben Stolberg, and others. The article pursued exclusively political aims, the defense of Bolshevism, the Russian Revolution, the Fourth International, from the petty bourgeois intellectual critics, and an attack upon their political program. I still consider that defense and that attack good. At least no one in our ranks has yet disagreed with it, not even Cannon, then or now. You say, quote, by allying himself in this question with the anti-dialectician Burnham, Shachtman deprived himself of the possibility of showing why Eastman, Hook, and many others began with a philosophical struggle against dialectics, but finished with a political struggle against the socialist revolution, end quote. I can agree with this more or less. On my part, it was a conscious and deliberate, quote, self-deprivation, end quote. But it was more than compensated for, in my opinion, by the fact that I was able to defend our fundamental political principles and program from revisionist attack, and to defend it jointly with a comrade whose views on philosophy differ from mine in such a way that Eastman, Hook, Co., might be able to exploit it politically. Should I attack Burnham at the same time? Burnham's opposition to dialectics is not consistent, in my view, as mine is not in his view, and his support of the revolutionary program of the with his support of the revolutionary program of the Fourth International. I say about his philosophical views, as he does about mine, that in the long run, they will or may have fatal effects upon his political position. Meanwhile, to the greatest possible extent, let us unite to defend that political position which we hold in common with the rest of the Fourth International against all its critics. If in that connection we have occasion to speak of philosophical questions, let us make it perfectly clear that on that subject we do not agree. You consider that an unprincipled block. If it is a block at all, I think it is a good one. If Burnham and Shachtman were to write a joint article on philosophy, or specifically on Marxian dialectics, that would be unprincipled. To declare a temporary truce on philosophy while the revolutionary political position is put forward, that is not unprincipled, rather it is a service to the party. Rosa Luxemburg may have been able to write more thorough criticisms of Kautsky and Bernstein during the war if she had also attacked their revisionism in the sphere of philosophy. But in that case, Liebknecht would not have written or signed these criticisms with her because of his well-known opposition to dialectical materialism. The philosophical front had to wait under the press of more urgent problems and disputes. My dispute with Burnham on the philosophical front will also have to wait, not because I believe, as you unjustly write, that the dialectic does not matter, but because there are more urgent problems to settle, and because Burnham is not making the dissemination of his philosophical views his main preoccupation in the party, or even one of his preoccupations. And because, like virtually all the other leading members of the party who accept dialectical materialism, I do not feel sufficiently equipped to write the kind of defense of dialectical materialism which it deserves. Meanwhile, I repeat, I am ready to make a, quote, block, end quote, with Burnham on the defense of the revolutionary program of the Fourth International, and to make it 100 times over. In the same letter to Gorky from the 25th of February 1908, Lenin writes, quote, Plekhanov considered Bogdanov at that time as an ally in the struggle against revisionism, but as an ally who was wrong insofar as he went along with Ostwald and further with Mach, end quote. That is, Bogdanov was a non-Marxist amachist in the sphere of philosophy. Quote, in the spring and summer of 1904, Bogdanov and I finally joined together as Bolsheviks and constituted the Tacit Bloc, which tacitly excluded philosophy as a neutral field, which lasted throughout the whole period of the revolution and gave us the possibility of carrying through jointly I don't know, I think there might be a typo here. The revolution, that tactic of the revolutionary social democracy, which in my deepest conviction was the only correct one, end quote. Lenin. Wherein does what you call my, quote, block with Burnham in the sphere of philosophy, end quote, differ from Lenin's block with Bogdanov? Why was the latter principled and ours unprincipled? I should be very much interested to know the answer to this question. How is it possible, some comrades ask, for Burnham, whose views on philosophy are not Marxian, to come to political conclusions which are Marxian? It would be quite sufficient to answer. It is possible, as may be demonstrated by facts. Burnham's position on the dialectics of nature, for example, did not prevent Burnham from arriving at the political conclusions embodied in the program of the Fourth International, any more than the complete ignorance of dialectics on the part of some comrades prevents them from arriving at the same political conclusions. Does this mean that the materialistic dialectic, the dialectical method, quote, are not important, end quote? It means nothing of the kind. It does mean, however, that there is a contradiction and inconsistency in Burnham's position. This has not prevented the party as a whole from collaborating with Burnham on innumerable political questions, from presenting Burnham as an authorized party spokesman, from appointing Burnham as an editor of its theoretical journal. By the same token, it does not and will not prevent me from collaborating with Burnham on all those political questions wherein we agree. The connection between a philosophical and programmatic position, a philosophical and political position, holds only, quote, in the last analysis, end quote. The connection is not always direct and immediate. Political positions are not directly deduced from philosophical positions by means of concrete and scientific analysis. Lenin could speak of, quote, our comrades in politics and opponents in philosophy, end quote, without revealing an inconsistency anywhere except in the comrades referred to. Both Engels and Lenin furthermore pointed out that the modern scientist, for all his opposition, end quote, to dialectical materialism, is compelled to one degree or another to employ the dialectical materialist method in his concrete scientific work. The materialist theory of knowledge, Lenin wrote, is one, quote, which natural science instinctively holds, end quote. That is often true of the science of politics, too, and I have observed it more than once, not only in the case of Comrade Burnham, but of others as well. These are briefly some of the reasons why I must reject not only your argument about the, quote, unprincipled block, end quote, in philosophy, but also your reference to the Burnham-Shachtman article as a justification for characterizing our group as a petty bourgeois tendency. As for the Canon faction and the question of dialectical materialism, the less said on the subject, the better for the faction. Following your article, its spokesmen may try their utmost to parade as the intransigent champions of Marxian philosophy, but the indifference to theoretical questions, to say nothing of philosophical questions, and even the contempt towards such questions which most of its representative leaders have fostered, is too notorious in the ranks of the party to require elaboration here. New section, the state and the character of the war. The Burnham position on this, the second question, is bad enough, you write, but, quote, even worse and more dangerous, unfortunately, are those eclectics who express the idea that the class character of the Soviet state, quote, does not matter, end quote, since the direction of our policy is determined by, quote, the character of the war, end quote, as if the war were an independent super-social substance, as if the character of the war were not determined by the character of the ruling class, that is, by the same social factor that also determines the character of the state. Astonishing how easily some comrades forget the ABCs of Marxism under the blows of events, end quote, Trotsky. Who are the, quote, eclectics who express the idea that the class character of the Soviet state, quote, does not matter, end quote, end quote? Who said it, written it, and when and where? I know of no such comrade and no such document. What then is our position? Simply this. It is impossible to deduce directly our policy towards a specific war from an abstract characterization of the class character of the state involved in the war, more particularly from the property forms prevailing in that state. Our policy must flow from a concrete examination of the character of the war in relation to the interests of the international socialist revolution. Our fundamental position on this question has already been stated in the document on the Russian question presented by the minority of the political committee. Let me elaborate some aspects of it here so that we may see how the different viewpoints are manifested in theory and in practice. What is the position of the Cannon Group boiled down to its essentials? The nationalized property determines the class character of the Soviet Union as a worker state. The Stalinist regime is based upon the forms of property created by the October Revolution, which are progressive and must be defended from imperialist attack. Consequently, in a war between the Soviet Union and a capitalist state, we are for the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, for the victory of the Red Army, and therefore for material and military support of the Red Army. You add, Comrade Trotsky, that war is, quote, not, quote, an independent super-social substance, end quote, and war's character is determined by the character of the ruling class, quote, that is, by the same social factor that also determines the character of the state, end quote. The property forms, in this case, the nationalized property. In spite of my recently acquired bad philosophical reputation, I cannot accept the clear implication of this position because I do not consider it a dialectical view of the problem. That is, it is based upon abstractions and not upon material realities considered in their dialectical interrelationships. According to this standpoint, private property is the social factor that determines the character of the capitalist state. The same factor also determining the character of the capitalist ruling class, which in turn determines the character of the wars carried on by it. And what holds true of the capitalist state holds true with the necessary changes of the worker state. In the first place, to speak of, quote, capitalist state, end quote, or of, quote, worker state, end quote, is to speak in terms of abstractions which do not by themselves answer the question of the character of a given war. The Germany of 1970 was not a feudal but a capitalist state in which private property relations were predominant. This capitalist state conducted an historically progressive war even under Bismarck and Wilhelm I against Bonapartist France, its oppressor. The Germany of 1914, also a capitalist state in which private property relations were predominant, conducted a reactionary imperialist war against France. The same social class based on the same property relations was in power in the two countries both in 1870 and in 1914. If these factors alone, considered abstractly, determine the character of the war, it would be impossible for us to distinguish the progressive from the reactionary war. The Italy of 1859 conducted a war against Austria, and the Italy of 1915 conducted a war against Austria. The first of these two wars has always been characterized as progressive by the Marxists, the second as reactionary. What determined the characters of these wars? In the case of both countries, in both epochs, the ruling class was the same and was based on the same property relations. The difference between the two epochs and the two wars lay in this. The young bourgeoisie was progressive because the young bourgeoisie fought for the establishment of national boundaries, for the establishment of the great nation-states of Europe against feudal decay, particularism, and atomization. The establishment of the great national capitalist states was progressive in its time not only because it broke down the feudal barriers to the development of the productive forces, but because the establishment of great national capitalist states created the most favorable arena for the final struggle of an independent proletariat against the last exploiting class. With the development of imperialist decay of capitalism, the same social order with the same ruling class is capable of fighting only reactionary wars. Where it was once permissible for the Italian proletariat to support even King Victor Emmanuel of the House of Savoy and the Italian bourgeoisie in their war for the national state, for freedom from Austrian oppression, it became impermissible for the proletariat to support the House of Savoy and the Italian bourgeoisie in their war, quote, for the national state, end quote, against Austria in 1914. Moreover, it is impermissible for the proletariat to support the Italian ruling class today, even in a war against a feudal state, Ethiopia. If we go by abstractions alone, we cannot explain why the war of the capitalist state like Italy against a feudal, semi-feudal monarchy like Austria was progressive in 1859, and a war of capitalist state like Italy against a feudal monarchy like Spain was reactionary in 1935. The ultra-leftists, you will remember, also proceeded from such abstract deductions, quote, capitalist state, capitalist war, end quote, in the case of the Spanish Civil War, and therefore denied the admissibility of defending the loyalist forces against the fascist forces. The character of the war fought by Bismarck in 1870 could not be determined exclusively or imminently from the character of the ruling class and its property basis, but from the social and political aims of the ruling class at that time, i.e. from its concrete historic role. From above by bureaucratic military as against Jacobin plebeian means, it is true Bismarck and the Junkers had as their aim the national liberation and unification of Germany from French and Russian oppression. That was historically progressive. When at the end of the war they aimed at expansion and annexation, the seizure of Alsace and Lorraine, the war was transformed into a reactionary war which was mercilessly condemned by Marx and Engels. But war is not a, quote, independent, sober social substance, end quote, you say. War and the aims of war are not divorced from the social-economic basis on which it is fought. That is true, of course. But the connection is not automatic and not mechanical or one-directional. It is a dialectical connection in which very often the political regime is the primary or immediate determining force. The economic, quote, regime, end quote, determines only, quote, in the last analysis, end quote. A most instructive and timely exposition of the interrelationship between the economic base and the political superstructure is contained in Lenin's famous polemical speech on the trade union question on December 30th, 1920. Quote, Comrade Trotsky speaks of the, quote, worker state, end quote. Permit me, that is an abstraction. When we wrote on the worker state in 1917, that was understandable, but when one says today, quote, why defend the working class, defend it against whom, there is no longer a bourgeoisie, we have a worker state, end quote, one commits an obvious mistake. The joke of it is precisely this, that it is not quite a worker state. Therein lies one of the basic mistakes of Comrade Trotsky. Our state is in reality not a workers' state, but a workers' and peasants' state. From the following a great deal, but still more. From that follows a great deal, but still more. From our party program, the following comes out, a document which is quite familiar to the author of the ABC of Communism. From this program, it comes out that our state is a workers' state with bureaucratic deformations. We had to paste this, how shall we put it, sorry label on it. That is the result of the transition. And now, do the trade unions have nothing to defend in such a practically arisen state? Can we even do without trade unions for the protection of the material and spiritual interests of the universally organized proletariat? That is theoretically a perfectly false consideration. That leads us into the realm of abstraction, or to the ideal which we shall have attained in 15 to 20 years. But I am not even convinced that we shall attain it in such a short period. Our present stage is such that the inclusively organized proletariat must defend itself, and we must utilize these labor organizations for the protection of the workers against their state and for the protection of our state by the workers, end quote. Lenin. And later on the same subject, the 25th of January 1921, in speaking of politics and economics, dialectics and eclecticism, Lenin emphasized, quote, politics is the concentrated expression of economics. I repeat in my speech, for I have already heard earlier the absurd reproach, inadmissible on the lips of a Marxist, that I treat the thing, quote, politically, end quote. The primacy of politics over economics must serve as the unconditional rule. To argue otherwise means to forget the ABC of Marxism. The question stands only thus, and Marxistically cannot stand otherwise without the correct political attitude towards the thing. The class in question cannot maintain its rule and consequently cannot fulfill its productive tasks either, end quote. I permit myself one further quotation from Engels' letter to Comrade Schmidt, October 27, 1890. Quote, the new independent political power must, of course, submit to the movement of production as a whole, but it also reacts by virtue of the strength of its imminent, i.e., its once barred but gradually developed relative independence, upon the conditions and course of production. There is a reciprocity between the two unequal forces. On the one side, the economic movement, on the other, the new political power which strives for the greatest possible independence and which have once arisen is endowed with its own movement, end quote. Engels wrote the above with reference to a capitalist state, it applies with a hundredfold multiplied force to the Soviet Union, where the political superstructure, the Stalinist state apparatus, has acquired a degree and type of independence from its social basis without parallel, at least in modern times. Now, what importance have these quotations from Lenin and Engels in our present dispute? The Canaanites deduce their policy in the following simple, undialectical way. The economy is progressive, consequently, the wars fought against capitalist states by the Stalinist regime, which bases itself on this economy, are also progressive. The quotation from your article cited above to the effect that the character of the war is determined by the character of the economy follows the same line of thought. It may be replied that this charge is groundless and a distortion of the position held by you and the Canon group. It may be pointed out that we have all spoken for years of a degenerated worker state, that we have advocated for some time a political revolution, basing ourselves on that very contradiction between the social basis and the political regime, and that in your latest article you write directly that, quote, in our struggle for the overthrow of the bureaucracy, we base ourselves on this contradiction, end quote. This reply is obviously based on fact. I do not for a moment intend to create a different impression. All I contend in this correction is that this all-important contradiction is not consistently considered and applied in the case of the wars conducted by the Stalinist regime. Just as it was possible 20 years ago to speak of the term, quote, workers' state, end quote, as an abstraction, so it is possible today to speak of the term, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, as an abstraction, just as it was once necessary in connection with the trade union problem to speak concretely of what kind of worker state exists in the Soviet Union, so it is necessary to establish in connection with the present war the degree of the degeneration of the Soviet Union. The degeneration of the Soviet state. The dialectical method of treating such questions makes this mandatory upon us, and the degree of the degeneration of the regime cannot be established by abstract reference to the existence of nationalized property, but only by observing the reality of living events. The Fourth International established years ago the fact that the Stalinist regime, even though based on nationalized property, had degenerated to the point where it was not only capable of conducting reactionary wars against the proletariat and its revolutionary vanguard, and even against colonial peoples, but did in fact conduct such wars. Now, in our opinion, on the basis of the actual course of Stalinist policy, again, even though based upon nationalized property, the Fourth International must establish the fact that the Soviet Union, i.e. the ruling bureaucracy and the armed forces serving it, has degenerated to the point where it is capable of conducting reactionary wars even against capitalist states, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, now Finland, and tomorrow Romania and elsewhere. This is the point which forms the nub of our differences with you, our difference with you and with the Canon faction. It is necessary to emphasize that there is a tremendous difference between the relative independence of the political regime in any given capitalist state and in the present Soviet state. Be it the democratic United States, constitutional monarchical England, republican France, or fascist Germany, the political regime in each instance is the one best suited to preserve private property. In any case, that is its essential role. Even in fascist Germany, where the bourgeoisie has been politically expropriated, we have said that the fascist regime is the only one under which capitalist private property can be preserved. In the Soviet Union, on the contrary, our program and theses point out that the political regime, the Stalinist bureaucracy, does not preserve but constantly undermines the social economic basis of the Russian Revolution. It is not only, as Engels puts it, quote, endowed with its own movement, end quote, and that to an exceptionally high degree, but this movement conflicts violently with, quote, the movement of production as a whole, end quote. Put in more plainly political terms, the interests of the bureaucracy conflict with the interests of maintaining nationalized economy as the basis for the transition to socialism. The nationalized economy, which is all we can defend in the Soviet Union. Now, it is not the nationalized economy that goes to war, it is the economy that decides when the war should be declared. It is not the economy that decides. Sorry, I need to repeat that whole sentence. Past few sentences I'm spacing out. is not only, as Engels puts it, quote, endowed with its own movement, end quote, and that to an exceptionally high degree, but this movement conflicts violently with the, quote, movement of production as a whole, end quote. Put in more plainly political terms, the interests of the bureaucracy conflict with the interest of maintaining nationalized economy as the basis for the transition to socialism. The nationalized economy, which is all we can defend in the Soviet Union. Now, it is not the nationalized economy that goes to war, it is the economy that decides when the war should be declared or started, or against whom it should be directed, or how it should be conducted. Nor does the working class make these decisions, either directly or indirectly, for it is gagged and fettered and straitjacketed. The decisions and direction of the war are entirely in the hands of the bureaucracy, which is, quote, endowed with its own movement, end quote, that is, with its own social, economic, and political interests, which are reactionary through and through. 1 second. Here we need not confine ourselves to theoretical speculation and argument. The invasion of Poland, the conquest of the 3 other Baltic states, the invasion of Poland, these make up, in fact, the reactionary war of the Stalinist bureaucracy. They are reactionary from a number of standpoints. They are reactionary because they drive the proletariat and peasantry into the arms of imperialist patriotism. That is, they do not accentuate the class struggle, but facilitate the submission of the proletariat to its enemy. They are reactionary because they are not conducted for the defense of the Soviet Union, i.e., the preservation of nationalized property from imperialist conquest and colonization, but are conducted in agreement with Hitlerite imperialism. They are reactionary because they are not conducted for the defense of the Soviet Union, but are conducted for the greater glory, prestige, power, and revenue of the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy. They are reactionary because they are not defensive wars. I speak not in the military, technical, or diplomatic sense, but in the historical, political sense. But wars of annexation, wars of what we call Stalinist imperialism. Once more, defense of the Soviet Union. We advocated and urged support of a war to defend the Soviet Union from imperialist attack. In that case, we did not insist upon democratic formalities and even democratic realities as a condition of our defense. We said, the minority continues to say it, that if the imperialists assail the Soviet Union with the aim of crushing the last conquest of the October Revolution and reducing Russia to a bunch of colonies, we will support the Soviet Union unconditionally. That would be a progressive war, even under Stalin's command and despite Stalin's command. We would fight for a democratic all-Soviet Congress to take over the helm, but we would not demand it as preliminary condition for our support. We did not advocate the invasion of Poland or the Baltic countries or Finland. We did not consider such actions necessary for the defense of the Soviet Union conceived in a revolutionary internationalist sense. On the contrary, we condemned the invasions. You even called the invasion of Poland, quote, criminal and shameful, end quote. To this day, I do not understand what right of formal or dialectical logic we should, in light of this, call upon the workers to give material and military support to the invasion, which has as its clear-cut objective that very annexation which we condemn and oppose. The Fourth International is now fettered by a dogmatic interpretation of the formula, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, which means in practice, see the resolutions of the Cannon Group, see our party press, that our policies are determined for us by the reactionary interests and the secret treaties, no doubt, of the Stalinist bureaucracy. When it decides to launch a war, we say, in effect, we do not agree with the timing of the war, with the aim it pursues, but now that Stalin has launched it, we must give it unconditional support, military and material aid. You will say that this is a distortion of the views of the Fourth International. Let us see. In your article, you write, quote, in order to give at least an ounce of sense to their new formula, the opposition attempts to represent the matter as if up to now we had, quote, unconditionally, end quote, defended the international policy of the Kremlin government with its Red Army and GPU. Everything is turned upside down. In reality, for a long time, we have not defended the Kremlin's international policy. not even unconditionally, particularly since the time we openly proclaimed the necessity of crushing the Kremlin oligarchy through insurrection. A wrong policy not only mutilates the current tasks, but also compels one to represent his own past in a false light." End quote. Trotsky. "And in your letter to me, dated November 6, 1939, you, Trotsky, write, quote, you interpret our past policy as unconditional support of the diplomatic and military activities of Stalin. Permit me to say that this is a horrible deformation of our whole position, not only since the creation of the Fourth International, but since the very beginning of the left opposition. Unconditional defense of the USSR signifies, namely, that our policy is not determined by the deeds, maneuvers, or crimes of the Kremlin bureaucracy, but only by our conception of the interests of the Soviet state and world revolution." End quote. Trotsky. "I pass over my, Max Shachtman's, quote, horrible deformation, end quote, and my, quote, representation of our own past in a false light, end quote, for I am conscious of no such crime. I have never said that our position was unconditional or any other kind of support of Stalin's international policy, and I must there set down this charge, too, as gratuitous and polemical. Let me accept, then, your characterization of our traditional position. We have never defended, not even conditionally, Stalin's international policy. We give no unconditional support to the Kremlin's diplomatic and military activities. Our policy is not determined by the Kremlin's deeds and crimes. Good. We have never supported the Kremlin's international policy. I repeat with you. Concretely, for example, we did not support the Kremlin's policy towards bourgeois Finland or Poland, etc. But what is war? War is the continuation of politics by other means. Then why should we support the war which is the continuation of the international policy which we did not and do not support? The Fourth International also told the Russian proletariat not to support the Kremlin's foreign policy. Then why should we now tell the Soviet workers to support a war which is the continuation of that policy? According to the resolution on Finland of the Canon faction which you support, the Fourth International tells the Russian workers not only to be Soviet patriots in general, but to give material and military support to Stalin's army in Stalin's war. What attitude the Finnish proletarians should take toward the Red Army, our fearless, quote, unconditional defensist, end quote, do not indicate by a single syllable. On what conceivable basis can we advocate such a policy to the Russian working class? How can we defend it before the American working class or even its vanguard elements? Perhaps the Red Army should be supported on the grounds that in Poland, for example, quote, the new authorities invited the population to expropriate the landowner and capitalist, end quote, as you put it in your new article. I have heard the Cannon Group's spokesman, following your line, argue that this demonstrates the essentially progressive character of Stalin's war, and that it is a significant reflection of the fundamental fact that the Kremlin is based upon state property which determines the character of its wars. This argument, in my opinion, is wrong on two counts. Insofar as it is calculated to prove that the wars of bureaucracy are automatically determined by the existence of state property in the Soviet Union, the calculation runs directly counter to our previous political analysis, yours in particular, and to the recently established facts. 1. 2 years ago, you wrote in a polemic against Burnham and Carter, quote, Hitler defends the bourgeois forms of property. Stalin adapts the interests of the bureaucracy to the proletarian forms of property. The same Stalin in Spain, i.e., on the soil of a bourgeois regime, executes the function of Hitler. In their political methods, they generally differ little from one another. The juxtaposition of the different social roles of the one and the same Stalin in the USSR and in Spain equally well demonstrate that the bureaucracy is not an independent class but a tool of classes, end quote, Trotsky. Not a workers' and not a bourgeois state, question mark. Internal Bulletin, December 1937. That piece is on this channel. In other words, there is no automatism of state property in the Soviet Union that forces the Kremlin bureaucracy to establish or even seek to establish similar property forms outside the Soviet Union. Quite the contrary, outside the Soviet Union, it follows in most cases the policy of preserving capitalist private property and massacring those who seek to abolish it. Spain! Exclamation point. 2. How account for the fact that in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, capitalist private property has remained intact under the rule of the Red Army? If the automatism of state property is so direct that it not only determines the character of Stalin's wars, but also its own extension to the capitalist countries invaded by Stalin, i.e., quote, social revolutionary measures carried out via bureaucratic military means, end quote, as you call it. Why hasn't this been the case in the 3 Baltic countries? Also, why does the program of the Kuusinen, quote, government, end quote, insist so explicitly not only on its non-Soviet bourgeois democratic political character, but on the fact that it does not propose to expropriate and nationalize property? You wrote in USSR and War, also on this channel, the following words, quote, let us for a moment conceive that in accordance with the treaty with Hitler, the Moscow government leaves untouched the rights of private property in the occupied areas and limits itself to, quote, control, end quote, after the fascist pattern. Such a concession would have a deep-going principled character and could become the starting point for a new chapter in the Soviet regime and consequently for a new evaluation on our part of the nature of the Soviet state, end quote. The Kuusinen program, I repeat, the second count deals with the, quote, progressive aspect, end quote, of the Stalinist invasion. In the article USSR in War, you said, quote, the primary political criterion for us in the transformation of property relations in this or another section of the territory, no matter how important these may be by themselves, but rather the change in the consciousness and the organization of the world proletariat, the raising of its capacity for defending the old conquest and accomplishing new conquests. From this one and the only decisive standpoint, the politics of Moscow, taken as a whole, preserve completely their reactionary character and remain the chief obstacles on the road to world revolution, end quote. Trotsky. War is a continuation of politics, and if Stalinist policy, even in the occupied territories where property has been statified, preserves completely its reactionary character, then the war it is conducting is reactionary. In that sense, the revolutionary proletariat must refuse to give the Kremlin and the Kremlin's army material and military aid. It must concentrate all efforts on overturning the Stalinist regime. That is not our war. Our war is against the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy at the present time. In other words, I propose in the present war a policy of revolutionary defeatism in the Soviet Union, as explained in the statement of the minority on the Russian question, and in making this proposal I do not feel myself one whit less a revolutionary class patriot than I have always been. You find our resolution on Finland ridiculous because it says that in applying the strategy of revolutionary defeatism on both sides, quote, the Fourth International will of course take into account concrete circumstances, the military situation, the moods of the masses, and also the differing economic relations in Finland and Russia, end quote. Your comment is, quote, definitely nothing of this is comprehensible, end quote. Let me try to make it somewhat more comprehensible and less ridiculous. In any country, whether we are defeatist or defensist, the application in the concrete of our strategical perspectives or slogans must take many things into consideration. For example, even under Kerensky, Lenin stood for the slogan of, quote, transforming the imperialist war into a civil war, end quote. At one time, in the middle of 1917, Lenin proposed the withdrawal of the slogan in that form. Why? Because of the military situation in the country and because of the moods of the masses. Moreover, taking into account precisely these moods, the fact that the masses were tired of the war and of fighting, quote, in general, end quote, the Bolsheviks concretized their perspective of civil war in the slogan of, quote, peace, end quote. Again, taking into account the, quote, military situation, end quote, during the Kornilov attack, the Bolsheviks again adapted their, quote, civil war, end quote, perspective to the concrete situation. The sentence in our resolution which you ridicule so much was included mainly for the purpose of guarding against the vulgar misinterpretation of our position, to mean that from now on, day in, day out, all we propose to do in Finland and in the Soviet Union is to repeat the phrase, quote, revolutionary defeatism, end quote. As for taking into account the, quote, differing economic relations, end quote, this really speaks for itself. In Russia, we tell the workers that they must establish their control over already nationalized property. In Finland, we tell the workers that they must first nationalize property after seizing power. When I write a resolution not about war but about the world's socialist revolution, I shall take care thereto to point out that in China and the United States, the Fourth International must take into account the differing economic relations, even though it is for the proletarian socialist revolution in both lands. By the same token, I will agitate for a political revolution throughout the Soviet Union, but in the Ukraine I will take into account the differing national element, and there I will advocate particularly separation from the Kremlin. The whole point seems to me to be quite self-evident. New section, the bureaucratic revolution. I cannot leave unmentioned your references to the, quote, revolutionary, end quote, role of Stalinism in its recent invasions. Quote, in the first case, Spain, the bureaucracy, through hangman's method, strangled a socialist revolution. In the second case, Poland, it gave an impulse to the socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods, end quote. Here again, I find myself compelled to disagree with you, Trotsky. He doesn't say Trotsky, but just to make sure I'm keeping the thread. I guess it's pretty obvious that he's speaking to Trotsky. Maybe it wasn't necessary, but oh well. The bureaucratic bourgeois revolution that I know of Napoleon's, quote, revolution from above, end quote, in Poland over 100 years ago. I know of Alexander's emancipation of the serfs, quote, from above, end quote, out of fear of peasant risings. I know of Bismarck's, quote, revolution from above, end quote. I know that Hitler and Mussolini play with an idea of an Arab, quote, national revolution, end quote, in Palestine out of purely imperialist and military reasons directed against their rival, England. But the bureaucratic proletarian revolution, that I do not know of and I do not believe in. I do not believe that it took place in Poland, even for a day, or that it is taking place or is about to take place in Finland. If Stalin, quote, established, end quote, state property in the conquered territory in Poland, it was not at all because, as you imply elsewhere, he was, quote, compelled, end quote, to do so on account of the irresistible force of state property in the Soviet Union. Stalin was perfectly willing to, quote, share the power, end quote, with the Polish bourgeoisie as he is doing it with the bourgeoisie of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia on this basis. I will preserve intact your private property, and you will turn over to me your political power, which I will assure with my army. That is what the Kremlin proposed during the negotiations with Anglo-French imperialism. The Polish bourgeoisie and landlords refused this, quote, generous, end quote, offer for a division of power. The three Baltic countries had the offer imposed upon them by force. When the regime of Polish colonels collapsed under the blows of the German army, the bourgeoisie fled in every direction. In Polish Ukraine and White Russia, where class exploitation was intensified by national oppression, the bourgeoisie of those territories was predominantly Polish. The peasants began to take over the land themselves to drive off the landlords who were already half in flight. Even the garbled and censored reports of these days permit us to see the workers were beginning to act similarly. In Vilna, a spontaneously formed, quote, Soviet, end quote, was reported. The Red Army entering Poland encountered no resistance from the Polish bourgeoisie and its army because there wasn't any to speak of. The Red Army came in as a counter-revolutionary force. Far from, quote, giving an impulse to the socialist revolution, end quote, it strangled it. The Vilna, quote, Soviet, end quote, was of course violently suppressed. Just what has since then been, quote, nationalized, end quote, how it has been, quote, nationalized, end quote, I do not know, and no one has yet been able to say exactly. In any case, I repeat with you that the nationalization, real or alleged, cannot be the decisive criterion for us. The Stalinist bureaucracy is capable only of strangling revolutions, not making them or giving an impulsion to them. To prove the contrary, some evidence must be produced, and I find none in your article. I find even less for you, how shall I put it, astonishing remarks about Finland. You say that we do not, quote, mention by so much as a word that the Red Army in Finland expropriates large landowners and introduces workers' control while preparing the expropriation of the capitalists, end quote. True, not by so much a word. True, not by so much as a word. Why? Because for the first anyone has heard in our party, anyone, of the expropriation of the large landowners and the introduction of workers' control in Finland by the Red Army is in your article. Where is this taking place? On what reports do you base yourself? There is no trace of workers' control in the Soviet Union today. There is even less than that in Finland. That, at least as far as my knowledge goes, and on this point I have questioned unavailingly many Canaanites. You continue, quote, tomorrow the Stalinists will strangle the Finnish workers, but now they are compelled to give. Why? In Finland and not in Spain or Estonia, a tremendous impulse to the class struggle in its sharpest form. The leaders of the opposition construct their policy not upon the, quote, concrete, end quote, process that is taking place in Finland, but upon democratic abstractions and noble sentiments, end quote. Trotsky. Where is this, quote, tremendous impulse to the class struggle, end quote, in Finland, end quote, in its sharpest form, end quote, to boot? We base our policy on, quote, abstractions, end quote. Let us grant that. On what do you base your statement about the tremendous impulse to the class struggle? No one. I repeat, it in our party has seen the slightest sign of it as yet. Perhaps you have seen a credible reports about it, in which case such important news should appear in our press. Again, you write, quote, the Finnish-Soviet War is evidently already beginning to be completed with a civil war in which the Red Army finds itself at the given stage in the same camp as the Finnish petty peasant and the workers, end quote. You write a little further that the Stalinist policy is, quote, the policy of exterminating finance capital, end quote. And finally, you write, as for the Kremlin, it is at the present time forced, and this is not a hypothetical but a real situation, to provoke a social revolutionary movement in Finland in order to attempt to strangle it politically tomorrow, end quote. Where is the civil war in Finland, which is, quote, evidently beginning, end quote? Unless you refer to the government of the idiotic scoundrel Kuusinen, we have not yet seen the first traces of that civil war. Regardless of how much we should like to see it, no matter how anxious we are to develop a policy that will promote it, no matter how firmly we count upon its eventual materialization. Do you deduce this, quote, civil war, end quote, from an abstract and false theoretical estimation of the role of the Kremlin bureaucracy? Or is there some objective evidence of this, quote, concrete, end quote, process taking place in Finland, end quote? Trotsky. Where is the, quote, social revolutionary movement in Finland, end quote, that the Kremlin is, quote, forced to provoke, end quote? It is perhaps the program of the Kuusinen, quote, democratic peoples, end quote, government that is provoking it. The program is formally the program of a bourgeois, quote, democracy, end quote. Since the beginning of the war, one of the reasons why we condemned the Finnish invasion as reactionary was precisely the fact that by the Finnish invasion, Stalin was driving the Finnish workers and peasants into bourgeois patriotic frenzy, into the arms of the Mannerheims. Who's Mannerheim? Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim lived from 1867 to 1951 and was a Finnish military leader and statesman. Mannerheim served as the military leader of the Whites in the Finnish Civil War of 1918 and as regent of Finland from 1918 to 1919 as commander-in-chief of the Finnish Defense Forces during the period of World War II, 1939 to 1945, and as the sixth president of Finland, 1944 to 1946. He became Finland's only field marshal in 1933 and was appointed honorary marshal of Finland in 1942. The Russian Empire dominated the Grand Duchy of Finland before 1917, and Mannerheim made a career in the Imperial Russian Army, serving in the Russo-Japanese War on the Eastern Front of World War I and rising by 1917 to the rank of lieutenant general. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim had a prominent place in the ceremonies of Emperor Nicholas II's coronation in 1896 and later had several private meetings with the Tsar. After the Bolshevik coup of October 1917 in Russia, Finland declared its independence 6th of December 1917, but soon became embroiled in the 1918 Finnish Civil War between the pro-Bolshevik, quote, Reds and the, quote, Whites, who were the troops of the Senate of Finland supported by troops of the German Empire. A Finnish delegation appointed Mannerheim as the military chief of the Whites in January 1918, and he led them to victory, holding a triumphal victory parade in Helsinki in May. After spending some time abroad, Mannerheim was invited back to Finland to serve as the country's second regent or head of state from December 1918 to July 1919. Despite being a monarchist, Mannerheim formally ratified the Republican Constitution of Finland. Mannerheim then ran against K.J. Ståhlberg in the first Finnish presidential elections in 1919, but lost and quit politics. Mannerheim helped found the Mannerheim League for Child Welfare in 1920 and headed the Finnish Red Cross from 1922 and to his death. Mannerheim was restored to a central role in national defense policy when President Sven Hufvud appointed him as the chairman of the Finnish Defense Council in 1931, tasked with making preparations for a potential war with the Soviet Union. It was also agreed that he would temporarily take over as commander-in-chief of the country's armed forces should there be a war. Accordingly, after the Soviets invaded Finland in November 1939 in what became the Winter War, Mannerheim replaced President Kallio as commander-in-chief and occupied the post for the next 5 years. He became a unifying symbol of the war effort and part of the core leadership of the country. He personally participated in the planning of Operation Barbarossa and led the Finnish Defense Forces in an invasion of the Soviet Union alongside Nazi Germany known as the Continuation War, 1941 to 1944. In 1944, when the prospect of Nazi Germany's defeat in World War II became clear, the Finnish parliament appointed Mannerheim as president of Finland, and he oversaw peace negotiations with the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. Already in declining health, Mannerheim resigned the presidency in 1946 and spent much of his remaining life in a sanatorium in Switzerland, where he wrote his memoirs and where he died in 1951. Participants in a Finnish survey taken 53 years after Mannerheim's death voted Mannerheim the greatest Finn of all time. During his own lifetime, he became, alongside Jean Sibelius, the best-known Finnish personage at home and abroad. According to Finnish historian Tuomas Tapora, a cult of personality began to be built around Mannerheim right after the Civil War. Given the broad recognition in Finland and elsewhere of his unparalleled role in establishing and later preserving Finland's independence from the Soviet Union, Mannerheim has long been referred to as the father of modern Finland, and the New York Times called the Finnish capital Helsinki's Mannerheim Museum, memorializing the leader's life and times, quote, the closest their thing is to a Finnish national shrine, end quote. Baron Mannerheim is the only person to have held the ranks of Marshal of Finland and Finnish Field Marshal. On the other hand, Mannerheim's personal reputation still strongly divides opinions among people even to this day, with some critics highlighting his role as the senior commander of the White Guard in the massacres of Red prisoners during and after the Finnish Civil War and the establishment of the concentration camps in East Karelia, in which poor conditions led to a high mortality rate. It says here above that he was participated, helped the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. Personally planning in Operation Barbarossa And if you don't know, Operation Barbarossa was the most devastating military campaign in human history. At least to my understanding. Let me click on it real quick. I'll probably say it in the first 5 seconds of Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest land offensive in human history, with around 10 million combatants taking part. Is there any note on casualties here? Sorry, I'm looking for casualties. Alright, where am I? Anyway. Since the beginning of the war, back to the text. Since the end of the war, one of the reasons why we condemned the Finnish invasion as reactionary was precisely the fact that by it, Stalin was driving the Finnish workers and peasants into a bourgeois patriotic frenzy, into the arms of the Mannerheims, into the, quote, sacred union, end quote, and, quote, national unity, end quote. What evidence is there that this has changed? We repeat, we know of none, not a scintilla. It is possible and even likely that as the Finnish bourgeois regime begins to crumble, the workers and peasants will separate from it and take the first steps on the road to independent class action. But there is even every reason to believe that they will not take the road to the Stalinist camp. They will not, as Cannon tells the Russian workers to do, give, quote, material and military support, end quote, to the annexationist invaders. If they do, their tragedy would be no less than that which they are suffering today as the pawns of bourgeois patriotism. You speak of the Stalinists representing, quote, the policy of exterminating finance capital, end quote. I find it difficult to believe that you mean this literally. No, the role the Stalinists have played above all outside the borders of the Soviet Union has been that of conservative prop of the rule of finance capital. The Kremlin agency of finance capital has not become overnight the latter's exterminator. It does not play a revolutionary role any more than the Chinese national bourgeoisie played a revolutionary role, any more than Guchkov played a revolutionary role in March 1917 in Russia. The role of the Stalinist bureaucracy is counter-revolutionary. Who the hell is Guchkov? Alexander Guchkov, who lived from 1862 to 1936, was a Russian politician, chairman of the Third Duma, and Minister of War in the Russian Provisional Government. I'm assuming he had a prominent place in the Kerensky offensive. Let me reread that sentence. The Kremlin agency of finance capital does not become overnight the latter's exterminator. It does not play a revolutionary role any more than the Chinese national bourgeoisie played a revolutionary any more than Guchkov played a revolutionary role in March 1917 in Russia. The role of the Stalinist bureaucracy is counter-revolutionary. Would I tell the Finnish workers to accept arms and ammunition from Stalin? Would I tell the Hindu workers and peasants to accept arms and ammunition from Hitler? That is how you pose the question. My answer is, of course I would. I would take arms for the revolution from Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin or Daladier, or from a Caucasian mountain bandit. If I get them free of charge, so much the better. But it would not follow for me that just because I welcome arms smuggled into me in Palestine, I would welcome arms smuggled into me in Palestine by Hitler, that I would welcome Hitler if he sent his army to Palestine, or that I would urge anybody to give that army, quote, material and military support, end quote. The, quote, character, end quote, of Hitler's intervention in Palestine would have changed. By the same token, when Stalin is conducting a reactionary annexationist war in Finland, I would readily accept arms from him if I were a revolutionist in Finland, although in that case 9 chances out of 10 I would receive his, quote, armed aid, end quote, in the form of a bullet in the heart or a bayonet in the throat. And under certain conditions, given a formal relationship of forces between his army and the Finnish revolutionary movement, I would even seek a practical military working agreement with him. But does not follow from this that I call upon anyone now to give him, quote, material and military support, end quote, in his reactionary war. I repeat, I do not believe in the bureaucratic proletarian socialist revolution. I do not mean by this that I have, quote, no faith, end quote, in it. No one in our movement has. I mean that I do not consider it possible. I reject the concept not out of, quote, sentimental reason, end quote, reasons, or Tolstoyan, quote, faith in the people, end quote, but because I believe it to be scientifically correct. To repeat that, with Marx, that the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself. The bourgeois revolution, for a series of historical and social reasons, could be made and was made by other classes in social strata. The bourgeoisie could be liberated from feudal rule and establish its social dictatorship under the aegis of other social groups. But the proletarian revolution cannot be made by others than the proletariat acting as a mass. Therein, among other things, it is distinguished from all preceding revolutions. No one else can free it, not even for a day. New section. The factions in the party. You support the canon faction as the proletarian, Marxist group. You condemn the minority as the petty bourgeois group and propose that the minority be disposed of accordingly. Reading your arguments, I involuntarily ask myself, how can the theoretical, political, and practical leader of the struggle against the, quote, troika, end quote, in Russia and then against Stalinism come to such conclusions? Comrade Trotsky, I've always been as close a student of the history of the revolutionary movement as possible. I've never considered such a study to be a substitute for active participation in the making of revolutionary history, but rather as a guide for such participation. My interest in this history is not so much for its own sake, but above all in order to learn how to avoid mistakes of the past and to emulate that which was worthy. In my own way, I've tried to keep unforgotten and live up to the best traditions of 100 years of revolutionary Marxism. So little do I ignore the traditions of our movement that I am sometimes perhaps rightly accused of, quote, archivistic, end quote, extremes. In extenuation for this sin, I have always pleaded the need of keeping alive in this generation of revolutionists, my generation, the best traditions of the past generations, to establish the idea and spirit of revolutionary continuity. My comrades sometimes jokingly chide me for my predilection, quote, for precedents, end quote. They have some reason for it. In good and tested precedents, I often seek and find a, quote, shortcut, end quote, in revolutionary politics. A, quote, shortcut, end quote, in this sense that I do not believe every single problem must be approached from the very beginning, as something brand new, as something which past experience of the movement cannot guide us in solving. If, therefore, I refer to this section of my letter to experiences of the past, and you will understand that it is not done in brittle polemical sense, but rather in the sense of helping myself and the movement and finding the right road with help of illumination from that past. Burnham says it is not a worker state. Aberrant says it is. Shachtman represents, as Hansen so tellingly puts it, the Taoist faction. Their block on the question of, quote, defense, end quote, and on the, quote, organizational, end quote, question is therefore unprincipled and typically bourgeois. Let us grant for the moment that the, quote, block, end quote, is as described. How many times have you been attacked by the Stalinists on the same grounds? You made a block with the Zinovievists, Leningrad, opposition in 1926. The platform of the opposition bloc, quote, evaded, end quote, the fundamental question of the theory of the permanent revolution. Why? The Stalinists insisted that the basic principal difference between Leninism and their, quote, Leninism, end quote, and, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, revolutionary Marxism revolved around the theory of the permanent revolution. The Zinovievists, who agreed basically with the Stalinist conception of the theory, agreed with you, that is, the Moscow 1923 opposition, to say that the theory was not an issue, and this was written into the documents of the bloc. Was it unprincipled? I do not think so. The bloc was united on the main political task before the Soviet Union and the International. In the bloc, at least for a considerable period of time, were not only you and the Zinovievists, who of course consider the Soviet Union a worker state, but also the democratic centralists who considered that it was not a worker state. Yet though you were formerly closer to the Stalin-Bukharin group on that question, the democratic centralists supported the opposition platform. Was that unprincipled? Again, I do not think so. In reply to one of the DC group comrades, Borodai, who asked you why steps should not be taken to reconsolidate the forces, the, quote, forces of the Bolshevik Guard, end quote. You wrote in 1928, quote, unfortunately, the question is not rightly posed by you. It was not I who separated myself from the DC, but the DC group, or the Democratic Centralist group, which belonged, It was not I who separated myself from the democratic centralists, but the democratic centralist group, which belonged to the general opposition, separated itself from us. ... The initiative for the unification into the bloc came from the democratic centralists. The first conference with the Zinoviev people took place under the chairmanship of Comrade Sopranov, DC leader. I say this absolutely not as a reproach, for the bloc was necessary and was a step forward, end quote. Trotsky. I wanted to say that if you're interested in the democratic centralist positions, I have a couple pieces by R.V. Daniels that discuss some of the aspects of the democratic centralists. So that's the end of the quote by Trotsky. So, you made a bloc, rather, you were in one faction with Radek, who characterized the famous canton bourgeois government as a, quote, peasants and workers government, end quote. The Zinovievists were for the, quote, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, in China. You were for the proletarian revolution supported by the peasantry. The united opposition, by the way, adopted the essential Zinovievist formula. The Stalinists sought to exploit these differences to the full. Yet the bloc there too, except for mistakes that cannot be characterized as fundamental in my opinion, was principled. All its members agreed, more or less, on the basic and immediate political tasks in China. Suppose one were to say, on the fundamental principled question of the class nature of the Chinese Revolution, Zinoviev had the Stalinist, i.e. petty bourgeois, position, democratic dictatorship, while Trotsky said, quote, it does not matter, end quote. Wherein would such a reproach differ from the one you directed us today? We say in our resolution that we, the minority, are united on the basic and immediate tasks of the Fourth International. Sorry, I think there's a typo here. The basic immediate tasks of the Fourth International. HI, the Soviet Union and other belligerents. To the extent that we differ among ourselves on the, quote, terminological or, quote, sociological question, the class nature of the Soviet state, each comrade will vote on this question. If it is put as he has voted in the past, according to conviction, do you find that unprincipled? You wrote me on December 10th, 1930, the letter is to be found in my introduction to your book, Problems of the Chinese Revolution, that though Radek was always with Zinoviev, on the question of the Chinese Communist Party withdrawing from the Kuomintang, quote, up to 1926, I always voted independently in the political bureau on this question, against all the others. Sorry. Where am I? See. You wrote me on December 10th, 1930, the letter is to be found in my introduction to your book, Problems of the Chinese Revolution, that though Radek was always with Zinoviev on the question of the Chinese Communist Party withdrawing from the Kuomintang, quote, up to 1926, I always voted independently in the political bureau on this question against all the others, end quote. When the bloc was formed, the majority was against you on this point. Quote, but since it was a question of splitting with the Zinovievists, it was the general decision that I must submit publicly in this question and acquaint the opposition in writing with my standpoint. Now I can say with certainty that I made a mistake of submitting formally in this question. End quote. Let me then ask if that made the opposition bloc unprincipled or that an error was merely made. You make a number of additional and minor points against us which are hardly meritorious. You say our resolution, quote, could be signed perhaps with slight changes by the Bordigas, Tharikin, Snevliet, Fenner Brockway, Merceau Pivert, and the like, end quote. Are you sure that also, quote, perhaps with slight changes, end quote, Cannon's resolution could be signed by Euler, Stamm, Marlin, and to the best of my knowledge, Molinier? You say, I don't know who all those people are, Amadeo Bordiga, Tharikin, I think Tharikin was Trotsky's secretary for some time. I don't know. Snevliet, who was the main guy who was kind of like probably the most, he was like, I think his party was kind of independent of like of international Trotskyism, but it definitely was like related to Trotskyism. Fenner Brockway was the leader of the Independent Labor Party. Merceau Pivert, I'm not sure. And Hugo Euler, I believe, was I don't know, I think he was a dissident Trotskyist early on. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm not going to look up all those people, but try to give some context off the cuff if I can think of them. You say that our criticisms, our quote terminology end quote, in part is copied from the bourgeois press. With as much reason, I could reply that such terms as quote thermidor, quote Bonapartism, and quote totalitarian, applied by us to the Stalinist regime, were used much earlier by the bourgeois and Menshevik press, with different connotations, different aims, yes, but that is true in both cases. You raised the question of Comrade Aburn. It would have been preferable if that were dealt with by Cannon. You write, quote, Aburn and only he has his own traditional group, which grew out of the old Communist Party and became bound together during the first period of the independent existence of the left opposition, end quote. On what do you base this? Permit me to say it, fantastic charge. Of the comrades in our party today who, quote, grew out of the old Communist Party, end quote, and who have been associated more or less consistently on the same side as Comrade Aburn, and are with the minority today, I can think only one name. I would be interested in hearing at least a couple of more names. What is the basis of your information, Comrade Trotsky? I have no intention of evading the famous, quote, Aburn question, end quote. I have had in the past many sharp disputes with the old Weber-Aburn group in general, and with Comrade Aburn in particular. Indeed, I once wrote a very harsh and bitter polemical document against that group which Cannon flatteringly called a, quote, Marxist classic, end quote. If a historical study circle were to be formed tomorrow to consider that period of our party, in our party history, there is much in that document I would repeat. Much I would moderate and much I would discard. Aburn, I suppose, would act in kind, but we are not discussing that period, and I find it impossible to shape my politics on the basis of outlived disputes. You know that before the fight against the Weber-Aburn faction, there had been a sharp dispute between Cannon's faction and the one led by me, a dispute lasting several years. One of the reasons I broke with many of the members of my then faction was because I insisted against them that the issues in the fight against Cannon had either lost their urgency or had the possibility of becoming moderated. Consequently, it was necessary to collaborate fraternally with the Cannon group on a new basis and not continue a die-hard struggle on outlived or vague issues or reminiscences. I am against political feuds which go on endlessly like Kentucky feuds. I was against them when directed at Cannon. I am against them when directed at Aburn. Cannon knows how spurious it is to inject into the present dispute the, quote, Aburn question, end quote. Cannon knows that every informed party leader and many members know, namely, that for the past several years at least, there has been no such thing as a, quote, Aburn group, end quote. So true is this, that the Chicago convention of the party 2 years ago, the slate of the political committee, represented by Cannon and me, had on it 4 ex-quote Aburnites, end quote, out of a total of 7 members, i.e. a majority. So true is this that since that time, Comrade Aburn has entrusted with some of the most responsible and confidential tasks that the political committee could assign to him. A party public document prevents me from going into detail on this point. At the last convention in July 1939, when the dispute arose over the, quote, organization document, end quote, and later over the composition of the National Committee, Comrade Aburn was in neither of the two contending groups for which Cannon, in the debate, went out of his way to praise the, quote, objectivity, end quote, and, quote, organizational intelligence, end quote, of Aburn. I know what the Canaanites mean with their campaign against Abern. Abern is all right so long as he, quote, comes along, end quote. However, the minute Abern expresses a different view from the canon leadership on an important question, then the campaign is launched against Abern, not on the basis of any views Abern now defends, but on the basis of a fight which is, I don't know how many years old. Here, too, I must remind you that you too joined with groups of, quote, remnants, end quote, of groups against which you had fought vigorously in earlier years, which you and Lenin had even severely condemned, workers' oppositionists, democratic sensualists, to say nothing of the Zinovievists. You will surely recall how the bureaucracy sought to concentrate the discussion not on the platform of the opposition bloc, but on what Zinoviev had written about Trotsky at one time, and vice versa, and about the, quote, unprincipled mutual amnesty, end quote, that extended to each other. You say that you and the Canon group give a class characterization of the minority, whereas, quote, the opposition, on the contrary, precisely because of its petty bourgeois character, does not even attempt to look for the social roots of the hostile camp, end quote. I could answer this in the first place by emphasizing part of the preceding sentence, quote, any serious factional fight in a party is always in the final analysis a reflection of the class struggle, end quote. Yes, generally, and in the final analysis, not at every given moment or with every factional grouping. I have no doubt of my ability to give many examples from the history of the Russian party after the revolution in which sharp factional fights took place. I think that it is doubtful if a clear class characterization could be given of all factions involved. I could say in the second and more important place, it is first necessary to prove A, that the minority represents a deviation from the proletarian Marxist line, B, that this deviation is typically petty bourgeois, and C, that it is more than an isolated deviation, it is a tendency. That is precisely what has not been proved. But it is true that the minority gives no political characterization. But is it true that the minority gives no political characterization of the Canon faction? It is somewhat surprising to read your article to see in reference to the allegedly long-lived Abern group and to see not a single word about the only permanent faction in the party, the Cannon clique, the group of comrades you refer to euphemistically as, quote, Cannon and his collaborators, end quote. When we speak of it as a permanent faction, we do not confine ourselves to mere assertion. We are able to prove it from the records of the party, and we do prove it in our document on the war and bureaucratic conservatism. How do you explain the existence of this faction and permanence in season and out, during political disputes and during peace times in the party? We characterize this faction with the political designation, quote, bureaucratic conservatism, end quote. Your comment on this is that we, quote, see only, quote, conservatism, end quote, errors, end quote, bad methods, end quote, and similar psychological, intellectual, and technical deficiencies, end quote. You consider our characterization of the Canon faction to be, quote, psychological, end quote. Excuse me, but I fail to understand. Let me quote from your polemic against the bureaucracy in the Russian Party in 1923. The, quote, heterogeneous political ideology that now rises against bureaucratism can be controlled all the better, and it can be cleansed of all alien and harmful elements, if we take more seriously the road of the, quote, new course, end quote. But that is impossible without a serious turnabout in the mentality and the intention of the party apparatus. But on the contrary, we are now witnessing a new offensive of the latter, which eliminates all criticisms of the, quote, old course, end quote, formerly condemned but not yet liquidated, by treating it as a manifestation of factional spirit. If factions are dangerous, and they are, it is criminal to close one's eyes to the danger represented by the bureaucratic conservative faction, end quote. Was that character's Trotsky, the new course? Was that characterization of the then leadership of the party, quote, psychological, quote, technical, quote, intellectual, and devoid of political or class significance? No more so than our present characterization of the Canon faction. You ask us to support this faction, or at least to subordinate ourselves to this faction. You declare that this is necessary because we are the petty bourgeois revisionist tendency, Canon the proletarian Marxist tendency. If your class characterization of the two groups were correct, your proposed solution of the party crisis might have validity. In that case, and in accordance with our class doctrine, the petty bourgeois must follow the proletariat and not lead it or even be joint leader of the party with it. The petty bourgeoisie, if it is admitted into the party as an organized group, should probably be given a, quote, second class, end quote, status. If it threatens to take over the leadership of the party, the proletarian wing has no other choice save to declare its organizational independence immediately, or in any case to have a split perspective precisely in view of the war situation. That is the political meaning I get from the concluding paragraphs of your article. This solution we cannot and will not accept. Comrade Trotsky, we do not believe Cannon represents the proletarian Marxist tendency. He represents the tendency of bureaucratic conservatism. And against this tendency, and particularly against its position on the Russian question, which represents an increasingly clear political capitulation to Stalinism, we must continue our struggle until our views triumph. Your support of the Cannon faction is very firm, Comrade Trotsky, but it is very wrong. This time I am unable to support your standpoint, a fact I establish with regard and even reluctance. I can only hope that the divergences narrow down in the period to come, but to expect me or my associates to support the Cannon faction and its position is to expect that we cannot and will not give. Several years ago, you stood insistently, even against widespread opposition, in support of the Millennier group in France. It, too, you represented as the revolutionary proletarian Marxist tendency. I do not hold that the opponents of Millennier represented all of them on all questions the best elements in the French and European movement. But in the end, you declared openly that Millennier had nothing in common with the Fourth International or with the working class movement. It goes without saying that Cannon is not Millennier, and it should be useless to try to make me appear to say so. But I believe that just as you were mistaken in your judgment of Millennier, you are mistaken in our present dispute in your judgment of Cannon and his clique. Just as you later acknowledged your wrong estimate of Millennier, I am firmly convinced that you will be obliged to make a similar acknowledgment about the Cannon faction in time to come. Some 6 years ago, if my memory serves me rightly, you wrote a comment on the factional fight in the American section between Cannon and Shachtman groups. The Cannon and Shachtman groups. In it you said that the party leadership, Cannon faction, represented a tendency towards Stalinist bureaucratism. You will be obliged, I am convinced, to reiterate the characterization in more elaborate, up-to-date form in the future. In your personal letter to me, dated December 20th, 1939, which I permit myself to quote from, you write, quote, I believe that you are on the wrong side of the barricade, my dear friend, end quote. I should like to believe that this is a polemical metaphor. You add, quote, I don't hope to convince you with these lines, but I do express the prognosis that if you refuse now to find a way toward collaboration with the Marxist wing against the petty bourgeois revisionists, you will inevitably deplore for years and years the greatest error of your life, end quote. From all that I have said in this document, you will understand why I find it impossible to accept your recommendation. For my part, I can only hope that your prognosis is wrong. In return, I can only say in a spirit which I believe you will understand to be animated by the objective interest of the cause, and with a due sense of proportion, the support you are now giving to the Cannon faction leadership and its political position. You will have occasion in the not distant future to consider as one of the most serious mistakes in the history of the Bolshevik-Leninist movement. With revolutionary greetings, Max Shachtman, January 1st, 1940. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening. There's some footnotes here. I'm not sure what they're connected to, but I'll read them because there's only a couple of them. Footnote 1 says, immediately upon reading this article, Comrade Dune sent the author an air-mailed letter declaring that he was proud to be a member of the party that had them in it. Neither he nor any of the members of the present majority faction noticed the unprincipled block in the sphere of philosophy at that time. In fact, it was generally understood that this long article was not just a literary exercise against intellectuals of no account, but through them an exposition in defense of the Bolshevik program on the main political questions of the day. 2. Endnote 2. If Burnham will forgive me for the comparison, let me quote what Lenin wrote about the priests in the party, end quote. Quote, If a priest comes to cooperate with us in our work, if he consistently performs party work and does not oppose the party program, we can accept him into the ranks of social democracy. For the contradictions between the spirit and principles of our program and the religious convictions of the priest could, in these circumstances, be regarded as matter in which he contradicts himself as one which concerns him alone. A political party cannot examine its members to see if there are any contradictions between their philosophy and the party program. Of course, such a case would be a rare exception even in Western Europe. It is hardly possible in Russia, but if, for example, a priest joined the Social Democratic Party and made it his chief and almost exclusive business to propagate religious views, then of course the party would have to expel him." End quote. May 26, 1909, Lenin. Lenin would not write a joint article with a priest on religion, but he would not hesitate, I am sure, to write one with a priest party member in defense of the party's political position, explaining therein that he finds, quote, "the religious convictions of the priest, a matter in which he contradicts himself," end quote. With due respect for the difference in proportions and in the person involved, the same applies in the case I am discussing. And note 3 says, the questions raised by Hansen's article and referred to by you will be dealt with amply in another document. End footnote. End of piece. Thanks for listening.